Today we're going to talk about planning the ITP and planning all of the present level of performance and the goals and the short-term tasks that need to happen in order to meet those goals. Remember, the transition plan is embedded within the individualized education plan for the student. So those two documents, or the way that the documents should work together, is it should be cohesive, and we'll talk later on about how the ITP is kind of situated within that IEP. It's important to remember that we're looking at long-term goals. We're not necessarily looking at setting things up for the short term in terms of what the student's going to do, this school year. This is more of a big picture type of plan. There will be some smaller objectives or smaller goals that will help us meet that long-term post-secondary goal, but it's not like an IEP where we say, okay, by the end of the life of this IEP in 1 year, the student will accomplish these types of math problems, or this proficiency in reading comprehension. It's designed a little bit differently, and we'll look at some of those goals throughout this PowerPoint. Now remember, when we're doing the goal setting, we're really looking at three questions. Where is the student now? Where are they going, and how are we going to get there? If you can keep those three things in mind, it'll help you design the present level of performance and the goals for the transition plan. When designing goals, it's really important to go back to all those assessments and inventories that we've been talking about and really reflect what the students' responses and preferences are. So we're going to use all those assessments to guide our planning for this particular portion of the ITP. In an individualized education plan, or an IEP, we have something called the present level of educational performance, or the present level of performance, the PLoP or the PLEP, however you define it. Some different counties actually have different terminology, but what this portion of the document is it's a summary of the student's strengths and weaknesses. It can include, just for different testing, what assessments have been completed. It may include teacher comments or teacher observations, as well as parent concerns. By the time we're talking about transition planning, it should also include student perspective. It should also include some statement from the student in that present level of performance. When you look at what the law says, these are direct quotes from the law, there should also be a section on how the child's disability impacts their involvement in the general education curriculum. So how is having a learning disability impacting the student from accessing what their general education peers might be accessing. There should be a statement written in objective and measurable terms, so everything should be written objectively. There shouldn't be words in there that you can't measure or observe. Things like, he's a nice boy, or he gets frustrated. Well, what does that mean? This should be very clear-cut for anybody who reads it, not just the people who know him. And the present level should directly relate to other components of the IEP, and that includes the transition plan. So if we're saying in the present level, this is the student's strengths and weaknesses, we would expect that the goals are going to sync with whatever is being written about that student's strengths or whatever that student's weaknesses are. So everything should be very streamlined from the beginning to the end. Well, more people are probably familiar with the present level of performance in an IEP. In a transition plan, that present level of performance also needs to take on things like instruction as it relates to transition, related services, whether that's community-based, or things like speech and language within the building. Community experiences, is the student volunteering? Are they involved in any organizations or clubs? The development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives. So in that situation, we're talking about, do they have a job? Have they been successful? Are they making strides towards living independently? Are they hoping to, live on their own or in a group home? And then, if appropriate, whether or not they are developing the daily living skills and the functional vocational evaluations that they need to develop. So can they, utilize transportation? Have they gone through any kind of vocational assessments to determine what the interests are, or what they're good at. So all of those things would also be included in a present level of performance when we're looking at a student who also has that transition plan. When writing post-secondary goals, what we're looking at is outcomes that we expect to happen after that student has graduated high school. These should be measurable, just like the present level performance, observable, objective as well, and shouldn't be written as the process. It should be kind of long term. When the student graduates, this is the job they are going to have, or this is, the schooling or the vocational training or the program the student will be enrolling in. It should be long-term and written in such a way that you're looking at the student's preferences, the student's needs, what their strengths are, and taking all this into consideration as well. I talked about how an annual goal is a little bit different in an IEP than in a transition plan. And so in an IEP, we talk about annual goals as being what we want that student to be able to do in a year's time. Often that may be things like improve reading comprehension from 75% to 85% on a, 10th grade level, whatever the case may be. But in a transition IEP, what we're talking about is what we want that student to be able to do within a year's time, but as it relates to that post-secondary goal. So if that student is going to be applying to community colleges, what do we expect that student to do in the next year in order to get closer to meeting that final goal? A couple of considerations when writing measurable post-secondary goals. You want it to reflect high but also realistic expectations. It should be something that will be obtainable for the student. It should reflect the student's environment or their situation. It should be individualized. It should be clear and concise. It should reflect some sort of forward movement approach instead of just kind of being a dead-end approach. Initially, it might be less specific, but as the student gets closer to graduation, it should be increasingly detailed. It may even change from year to year. We've seen that things change with everyone, not just students and not just students with disabilities, but it may change from year to year. Sometimes it may just change slightly. Sometimes it may change dramatically, and that's okay. And in the end, it should really paint a visual image of where the student is going to go, what that student desires for their future. In the next couple of slides, you'll see some leading questions to help you start thinking about post-secondary goals, and so that you can start exploring with the student and with the team what kind of goals would be most appropriate. Goal writing can take up an entire semester, but a couple things that you should remember when you're just thinking about specifically post-secondary goal writing. You want to do things that are result oriented. In other words, you want something that can be measured, whether it's enrolled in, worked, lived independently, all of those types of wording. You want to use descriptors if we're going to be talking about a student, and employment. Are we talking about full-time? Are we talking about part-time? And even sometimes breaking that down a little bit further to say that the student will, work. Maybe we're only hoping for 10 hours a week if the student has pretty severe disabilities or isn't able to, at this time, be very successful. We're just going to kind of gradually get to that point. So make sure you're kind of defining that. And you always kind of begin with after high school. That's always your lead. And this is all advice from the National Transition Center, and you may have seen more of this type of information on the other documents that were posted to Canvas this week. On the next couple of slides, you'll see some examples of post-secondary goals. You'll see both the movement from freshman to the senior year, as well as different areas within transition in terms of independent living, community-based experiences, and those types of things. So take a look at the next couple of slides and read through and kind of look at the differences and how the goals change from each of the different areas and through the course of high school. There's a lot of information on this particular slide, but what I really want to point out and kind of drive home is that there should be a connection between the transition plan and the student's IEP. The goals that are in the IEP should be a good match with the transition plan and vice versa. It should really complement one another, and it should be one cohesive document. The previous slide gave you some hints for developing goals and gave you an opportunity to kind of reflect on the goals that had been written. This is another way to go through and do some reflection on whether the goals are meeting all of the needs. So you'll see a lot of things we've talked about with those measurable, observable, and objective goals, whether there's a connection between the present level of performance and the rest of the IEP, and whether or not that the goals as they are written reflect growth and can be achieved within an academic year. This slide and the next few slides will also give you some examples of transition activities or some types of goals that may be tied into this particular student's IEP based on those long-term post-secondary goals that you saw in some of the earlier slides. You'll be able to see the connection between the transition goals and the IEP and see that it is one cohesive document. Although the transition planning process really is not simple, it can be summarized pretty quickly by answering the questions that are indicated on this particular slide. And it really does go back to the very first things that we were introducing. Where are they going, and how are we going to help them get there? And then we have to kind of fill in the gaps in order to make that happen for them.